That's really the point of the program I run at MIT. And so it's in that sense that I want to do this talk about sort of lessons from COVID. And I am going to share my screen here because I have a PowerPoint that lets me walk through some of the main points I want to make about this. I'm one of the interesting things about COVID-19 is that it's made science journalism very visible, right? I mean, throughout my career and often in my career, science journalists were kind of, oh yeah, those people who do the weird geeky stuff. And often they would be relegated to the science page. They have one at the New York Times, Science Times, in which people who are actually interested in research would be shuffled off to this one section, but it was never considered really part of general daily news, which I think is a big mistake. The world is science, right? Science explains so many things, and science, technology are powerful transformative forces, as we all know. And so one of the things that's happened with COVID is that people who can translate medical research and understand science become much more visible and much more prominent. And so both what we do well and what we do not that well is sort of on a vast public stage. I'm director of the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. And I'm going to walk through a couple of points, one of which I just addressed. And I really think of this as something for editors as well as reporters. What we do is really important. You need to have someone who has some kind of background in science, or at least has been a science journalist long enough to understand the process and the system and be comfortable asking fearless questions. Really, ideally at every publication. A lot of them can't afford it, and there are ways that the community of science journalists is now working to try to bridge some of those gaps. But it is really important to have in the mix of journalists people who understand science and how it works. Science is local. I pulled up these maps yesterday, actually, and so they're incredibly recent portraits of what's going on with COVID-19 at the moment, both in India and the United States. And they make a couple of points. Science, what we cover in health and medicine it's important to do that in recognition of where we are and to provide information to people about what's going on where we live and in our own backyards. But if you look at these two maps, you will also see that both of them tell stories specific to the local audience, right? So that if as you do, I live in India, I can look at this map of India and it's going to tell us a specific story to me about where the virus is most prominent. And if I was a science journalist, why is it flaring up, here in this particular southern region of the country, and what does that mean for the rest of the country where it seems to be fairly low? And so you look at it and you analyze it and it tells the story for you. If I go over to the United States, this map tells a story, and this is the other point I want to make. The map of India would tell a story if you understand the geography and politics of India. The map of the United States does exactly the same thing. And this particular map, which is fairly granular as to where COVID is sort of flaring up in the United States. Now, we'll tell you a couple of things if you're familiar with the sort of geography and politics of the United States, and you've been tracking the pandemic. If you look to the far northeast on that map where I live, you'll see that the colors are not as dark. That was not true a couple weeks ago. We were the bonfire and the Omicron wave a couple weeks ago. And so the pandemic and the caseload has been sort of shifting to the west. And if you look at it even further, what you're going to see is where barring California, which has really struggled with the Omicron wave, what you're seeing is the pandemic flaring in what we call in the United States red states that are very resistant to COVID protective measures, anti-mask, anti-vaccine. And so that sort of checkerboard of high COVID caseloads really relates to the sort of anti-COVID safety measures in the parts of the United States. And you'll see floating off there, it shouldn't be in the ocean, but no one can ever figure out how to do these maps and include Alaska, but that dark red, very dark red, almost island looking thing floating out there is the state of Alaska, which is actually north of us and adjacent to Canada. And that's a very red state, a very anti-vax state. And so this map will tell you that all of those resistances have come into play, and that Alaska is overrun with COVID. So that's a very local viewpoint. But the job is not local, but global. And one of the things that COVID will remind us, and again, this is a map from this week of where the virus is most dominant, is that science stories are global. And in fact, the big science stories of our era, currently the pandemic and whatever pandemic comes next, and climate change, are entirely local stories. So when we look at our local maps or our local reporting, we need to put it into this international kind of perspective. How bad are we related to the rest of the world? One, what parts of the world are driving the pandemic? Two, where does the pandemic, not that we know, but where does the pandemic seem to be going? So in this, you'll see North America and Central America, notably the United States, are a big bonfire of COVID. There you can see Alaska as it is, attached to Canada, and actually has no geographic continuity with the mainland United States at all. And people in Alaska actually call the rest of us down unders. So, but you'll see that Africa, where Omicron started, South Africa was the original source. It's fairly contained there. And so you can really look at where do we think the virus is going, and what does it mean that certain countries are such hot spots. It's important as a science journalist to remember that we've been here before. I'm a science history focused science journalist. When I did my grad degree at the University of Wisconsin, it was a environmental reporting degree with an emphasis on toxicology, actually. But my advisor told me to take a lot of science history classes as part of my program, because he said journalists who understand the history of the field, are not as easily fooled about what came before and by outrageous claims of being the first, because you actually know they weren't. In the case of pandemics, we've been here before. This is an illustration from the medieval bubonic plague pandemic, which was dominant in Europe. And I especially like this particular drawing because at the time, they did not fully understand, of course they didn't understand. They didn't have the tools to understand what was driving bubonic plague, which is a disease often carried by rats and fleas. And so they saw it as this evil thing floating in the air, and they came up with masks. And this bird-like mask is a plague mask. And we see masks again in the 1918, 1919, 1920 flu pandemic. And so these, although people are dressed very differently, you can look at this and see a couple of lessons for today. And it's important to know this. When I'm covering almost anything, I'm like, well, how did we get here? Because the history of science will tell us how we get here. And theoretically, it should remind us not to repeat the mistakes of the past. I don't think that happens necessarily. I think, humans are expert at repeating the mistakes of the past, and quite often. But if you look at the sort of graph of the flu pandemic of the early 20th century, and that was avian flu. It was an influenza A, avian flu, very mutant. And so you can see where it first starts. It's in the winter, right in early 1918. And then it, flattens out in the summer. Influenza, even more than COVID, is a seasonal virus. And so flattens out in the cover, everyone thinks it's fine. It also mutates, right? It became, as they pick this apart, they believe the virus mutated, as we saw with Delta and Omicron this time, to something much more infectious. And so now you see this enormous peak, right, that tracks into the winter, goes down again into the summer, and then again, you see, a third peak. This virus is thought to have killed between 25 and 50 million people worldwide by the time it was done. And the other point that this will tell you, which COVID tells you, is if you look at COVID, when it first sort of started boiling up in early 2020, it was a new virus. There was no immunity to it. There were no vaccines. We have kind of iffy flu vaccines, at least at the moment, but there was no natural immunity. And so it just went everywhere. And you see this here too. It's early in the 20th century. There's no vaccines, there's no immunity, the virus is king, and you get these large population events in which it makes way for a virus to mutate. So we could have predicted some of what we see with the COVID pandemic today, and probably some people did, but it's not that public policy always follows scientific knowledge. As journalists, though, there are other mistakes that I'm going to argue that we should not repeat, based again on previous pandemics. This was the 1918 bird flu pandemic. I love this cover of Time magazine from the time because it's so ridiculous. Death threat with a picture of a chicken. It actually usually makes me want to laugh, but don't do this as journalists. This is a huge mistake, to overhype the risk, to overhype the treatments, right? I was just talking to a colleague of mine from Argentina who was talking about the journalistic hype over treatments and how people would jump to them and then they wouldn't be cured. And even with vaccines, I think, many people somehow, and I don't know why, because we have a long history of being vaccinated for other things, but people acted as if vaccines were like a magic shield against the virus, when that's not really what vaccines do. They, ramp up your immune system to recognize the virus. That doesn't mean the virus can't overwhelm your immune system. It means that you're less likely to get sick, and you're far more likely to have a mild illness, far less likely to get sick. But even the best of the mRNA vaccines weren't 100% protective, and far less likely to be ill, which is probably or severely ill, which is the most important thing. So don't hype, don't stereotype. And this goes also to origin stories, right? Let's not stereotype the sources of any virus or other infection, and don't panic, right? And I think that one of the things that journalists do walk in a very difficult balancing act is both to say to people, this is serious, take protective measures, and try not to entirely freak them out. There are smart things we've done in the past. And we debunk misinformation. That's become a huge problem in this pandemic, but it comes up with every pandemic, you'd be interested to know. And so you started seeing in Africa with the Ebola outbreak, people really pushing back against the idea that Ebola was, it wasn't a virus. It was some evil plot by the military. It was all these different things. Ebola is just real. And that's one of the jobs that I think good journalists do, is stand up for reality. In this pandemic, probably the biggest challenge has been misinformation about vaccines. These are a little pixelated, sorry, but I like the images because there's so much misinformation on them. People portray the vaccines as entirely experimental when it comes to the mRNA vaccines, but that's an old technology that was just used in a new way. And certainly if you've been vaccinated, as most of us have, I hope by now, with an mRNA vaccine, it's not an experiment. We know how it works. And it also, because it uses mRNA technology, it has nothing to do with changing your DNA. It merely uses a small part of mRNA. This is an RNA virus, uses messenger RNA to create a sort of small part of the spike of the virus that your immune system recognizes and then is prepared against the virus. It doesn't change your DNA. It doesn't recreate the virus. It's just designed to do a sort of immune trigger. And this is a pushback against that argument from Australia. It's a poster that tells your body how to recognize COVID vaccine. And so it creates part of the spike protein, which is used to make the virus infectious. And then your immune system can actually recognize that and fend off the virus. That's all it does. But people take this and put out all kinds of information. And so you get this enormous anti-vax movement. We at KSJ do a lot of things to try to push back about that in sort of longer term ways. We run a project in which we try to train people who edit science. If you go to our website, there is a free downloadable handbook on how to edit science stories. You can read it online, or it's a downloadable PDF currently in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And we're working on other translations, and it will walk you through all kinds of things, how to vet a source, how to deal with controversial science. So we just give that away for free. And we also run a fact-checking project. And the idea of the fact-checking project, we train people in fact-checking. We get a lot of people from India who come to our virtual workshops, actually. And we try to make them think in the meticulous, let's get it right way that fact checkers do. Professional fact checkers are the most detail-oriented people in the world. And I wanted to just show you this. This is a typical fact check for the magazine that we publish, Undark, in which the fact checker goes through, color codes the story according to emphasis, underlines every single fact that has to be checked. And then the author has to come back on this other side, you'll see, and say, here's the source, here's how I can prove that this is right. And so we want to put as many stories as we can through this kind of sieve, because one of the ways we build trust in journalism is to get it right going out the gate. And so this is not post-publication fact-checking. This is a real emphasis in science journalism on getting it right. We have also, if you go to our website, we have another fact-checking workshop. They're virtual and free on our website that you can sign up for. I'm not really overselling this, but you're welcome to take a look at it. One of the people who talks in our workshops is the head fact checker for National Geographic. And he does a case study, and the last one he did a case study of fact checking the border between India and Pakistan, going back into State Department. It was really fascinating. So, but we want people to think in this very granular way, and we want people to think about actually every detail of getting things right. And the other thing we want journalists to do is not to fear repetition. This is one of my favorite quotes from an 18th century doctor of medicine in France. Do not fear to repeat what has already been said. Men, it's the 18th century, so of course it's men, need the truth dinned into their ears many times from all sides. The first rumor makes them prick up their ears, the second registers, and the third enters. And this is important in journalism because journalism has a kind of allergy to repetition, right? And so it's like you'll go to your editor and say, I want to do this story, and they'll go, well, we've already written about that, right? That's not news because we've already done it. And so it's really important in journalism to recognize, both for a story that is an evolving story, but also in our efforts to counter misinformation, the people who produce misinformation repeat it many, many, many times. So it's on us to go against the sort of culture of journalism and say, but yes, but repetition is a good thing. And the way we need to do that is to look at it in different angles, right? I'm going to tell a story about the COVID pandemic, but I'm going to tell it from the perspective of a patient. And this time I'll tell it from the perspective of a doctor. And this time I'll go into a bench science laboratory, and this time I'll be out in an infected neighborhood, and you have to really think, I'm going to tell that story. It's going to feel different every time, but the grounded information in it is going to be repeated again and again. I approach official sources with caution, right? Your readers do, or your listeners do if you're broadcast. This is a picture from Brazil following the huge wave of COVID deaths, because Bolsonaro, who is, the leader in Brazil, is very anti-vax and anti-protective measures. Although actually Brazil's vaccination rate, people have started ignoring him, it's actually better than the United States right now. As an example of a leader who, really couldn't be trusted, our former president, Donald Trump, and this is from an interview he gave, in which he acknowledged that he downplayed the severity of the pandemic. He says in this interview he didn't want to create a panic, but he's also on record saying that high numbers made him look bad, and so he also muffled the numbers. So it's really important to remember as a journalist that just because someone is in a position of power doesn't mean they're believable. Be comfortable with the idea that information and facts are going to change. They change all the time in science, right? Journalism is an event-driven media. Science is a process, and that culture clash again tends us to kind of make it sound like, a vaccine, a discovery about a drug, or a report about a drug is an end point, but it isn't. It's a data point in an ongoing inquiry. And so our knowledge changes. And if you look at the pandemic, you may remember that early on, there was a belief in the scientific community that COVID was not particularly an aerosolized virus. They believed that the kind of droplets that spread with, when you exhaled, viral particles were too big to actually hang around in the air and float for a long time and be infectious. And they believed that these droplets fell fairly rapidly to surfaces, and so surfaces were the real danger. And there was a period early in the pandemic where all of us were, wiping our groceries down with, disinfectants. And here is a picture from China in which they're basically spraying the world with disinfectants. As people got to understand the virus better, we realized that was not true, right? And here you see this kind of gradual understanding. Where does how aerosolized is the coronavirus? Ebola, which is more of a blood transmitted, body fluid transmitted virus, doesn't spread that far when you cough. But there were these big questions as to how far COVID spread until we realized that it's a fully aerosolized virus and it can spread. They actually haven't figured out how far it can go. There was one study at MIT that suggested 24 feet, and that it hangs in the air for quite a while. And so that got used against the scientific community, because it's like, well, you told us, we didn't need to wear masks. Now you say we have to wear masks. So it's important for science journalists here to make people understand that knowledge evolves, and we want it to evolve, right? That works in our favor. We vet sources as a counter to Donald Trump, Anthony Fauci. We vet numbers, and this is really important. And I like this particular graph. It's from early in the pandemic, because if you look at it, it suggests to you that there's like these much greater number of infections everywhere but the United States, right? The United States has about 40,000 confirmed cases. Italy has 28,000. South Korea has 8,000. But when you drill down into the numbers, what you realize is just that the US isn't testing, right? There's 25,000 tests in the United States. There's 274,000 tests in South Korea. So you have to really vet numbers and try to figure out what story they actually tell, and not just go with the superficial numbers. Pandemic lines are storylines. That previous graph was from Amy Maximum, who is an infectious disease reporter at Nature. And she makes the point that, and this goes back to my finding different angles, that there's all these different ways that you can find sort of narrative stories in a pandemic. And this fits what I think of as the first rule of narrative writing. which was something that one of my book editors taught me, which is that when you're doing a narrative story, you get your hero in trouble and you keep him or her there until the end of the story. And that's just a classic narrative writing trick. You are building in suspense. You're not going to necessarily put the answer or the resolution at the start of the story. You're going to let the story unfold so that you can pull the readers all the way through to sort of, you know, the reward of reading the story. And get your hero in trouble and keep him or her there is an essential rule for narrative writers. It's also important to be more responsible than provocative. So even though we're trying to write a compelling story, we're not going to hype it. We're not going to overstate facts, or at least ideally. And be honest that we don't have all the answers, right? You actually want people to embed in the story that this is what we know now, and that knowledge is an evolving process, and that we're not all that good at being predictive. So these global maps, the map which has Canada and South Africa and Australia, and in a few cases brightly lit, is what Omicron looked like when it first started showing up. It was just really hot spots in these scattered parts around the world. This other map is what it looks like today. Could you have predicted that the first would turn into the second in this way? I don't think so. I don't think we know enough to make those kind of predictions. I don't think we've figured out vulnerabilities and viral spread, and built into that is all the cultural who is really, you know, standing up to the virus, and what are the medical systems in place. And so predictions are incredibly complicated, and, you know, there's reasons why we're not that good at them. And finally, we talk a lot in journalism and in other fields about the fact that ethics matter. And I want to make the point that what we mean by that is that people matter, right? I mean, why do ethics matter? They matter because what we do in science and technology affects lives. And I could expand this out in an environmental sense to say, and animals matter and all living creatures matter, but for purposes of something like a pandemic, people matter. This is a COVID ward, of course. And so when you're making decisions about how you're going to tell a story and how you're going to identify a person, and whether you've given them full understanding of the fact that they are going to be identified, and all the other things that go into putting a story together, you know, if you think of yourself as an ethical journalist, that's just another way of saying you're a journalist who believes that people matter. And those, I think, are some of the most important points for me that have come out of the pandemic. And I'm going to stop the share now, but I am happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah. So who wants to go first? Can you just raise your hand?
Any questions?
So can I?
Yeah, go ahead, shoot.
Hi, thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us tonight. So, ma'am, when you write, like when we are writing or when we are producing, when we are shooting something which relates to, say, pandemic, right? So there's a certain amount of barrier, or you can say a gatekeeping, which you have to put forward, right? Like this information should go in, this shouldn't, this visual should go in, and this shouldn't. And we saw this in pandemics, especially in pandemic. There were disturbing images which came through the media, may that be Western or Indian. So that created a so-called panic in the mass itself. And like we saw during the second wave when it was in India, so there was this kind of panic in the country, and the media was trying to report it, but at the same time it was escalating the panic in the country. So at that time, a role of a science journalist, according to you, what should be like? Should he or she or them, like, they should allow this thing to happen, or they should say no, there's a certain amount of information that we should flow, and here's our gatekeeping ethics coming. So according to you, what's your take on
Yes.
it?
That's a really, really good question. So, and I think I said, like, in journalism, we walk a line between inciting. We want people to actually understand that there's a risk and be concerned enough to take protective measures. Ideally, we're not inciting them to such panic that they turn on other people, say, or that they lock themselves in their house and deny themselves good medical treatment. So, and I think all of us have found that very difficult in this particular pandemic. And if you're a science journalist where you're constantly bombarded with bad things, right? You do have to make those kind of decisions. We have seen, I think, almost from every country, some really horrible images of mass deaths and mass burials, and in the United States early in the pandemic, and then again in the Delta wave, there were so many people dead that they had to hire refrigerator trucks for the bodies because there was no place to put them, right? You want that information to be out there because you actually want people to be saying, this is a dangerous virus and I should take these protective measures. And also, I think that sometimes the subtext is you're putting pressure on the government, right? You don't always see it, but a lot of times when the media goes into an issue and says, this is really a problem, we're seeing these public health failures, they're not so much trying to panic people as they're trying to prod the government to do the right thing, right? And so I think it's absolutely right that we're going to step over the line. And I think there are always going to be some people who panic. And I guess what I don't believe most in the gatekeeping sense, I'm not a big fan of gruesome images. I understand, and I'm not a photographer, right? But I understand why the media will use them to illustrate a kind of crisis point. There are ones that I know personally from working at newspapers. I worked for 5 newspapers before I became a freelancer and an academic. That like, especially in traumatic events, there were photos we just wouldn't use, right? That they were too graphic, they were too upsetting, right? And people would really respond to even the milder images in a way, right? My feeling is, in general, when you're reporting, I'm going to say, on a war or on a catastrophic accident or a pandemic, often what you see in the media is actually not as bad as it is, right? Because you are trying to walk that line of what can people actually comfortably see. I'm speaking with images for a minute, but when I worked for the St. Petersburg Times in Florida early in my career, they used to have something they called the cornflake test, which is, can you look at this image at breakfast and keep your cornflakes down, right? Is the image going to actually make you nauseated? If so, we won't run it. And so I would cover things, and they were so much worse that was in the paper. And as a science journalist, one of the things I do is I try to be really selective about, how much am I going to overshare about things that might happen. For instance, in the United States, there's quite a bit of discussion. One of the interesting things about the coronavirus, this particular coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is that it moves pretty easily between species, right? We believe it originated in another species in China, possibly bats. We know that it can move back and forth. Cats can be infected, dogs can be infected. Animals in zoos have gotten COVID, and in the United States, there's actually an epidemic of SARS-CoV-2 in deer, white-tailed deer. And some of the virologists I've talked to, some of the very good virologists I've talked to, say they're worried that the deer are going to drive another variant of concern, that the virus is spreading rapidly through thousands of deer, that it's mutating, that it'll transfer back into humans, and we'll see another variant of concern. I make a note of that to myself, And when I see research on it, I write it. But what I'm not doing is writing, let's panic, the viruses and deer stories, right? And so I'm going to make those kind of calls. Let's wait till the knowledge has gotten to enough of a point that we know enough about this that we can say, yes, this is actually worried. And so speculative stories, this could be great, this drug could be great based on one test, right? One study, all of those should not be done, right? I think you really do have to consider the impact on people, and you don't want to drive a panic over something that's not real yet.
Thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up question there, sir.
Sure.
Yeah. Ma'am, we have seen in this pandemic, especially that the WHO especially coming up with information which, like for example, if for WHO they said that the coronavirus is not an airborne disease, but later on it said like it's an airborne disease. So during these times, science journalists, like for example, I published a article saying that it's an airborne disease. Later on, 2 months later, they said it's not an airborne disease. So the information which I published 2 months back, it's fake news. Practically, it's a fake news.
That's so frustrating. The American Association for the Advancement of Science gives awards in science journalism, and this year I think their public virtual ceremony is coming up next week or this week. Now I'm not sure, but they were really international awards, and one of the awards, the gold medal awards, was from an Indian journalist this time. Which was really exciting. I mean, and a wonderful story. And one of my former fellows who lives in Bangalore, I think, Anil Anaswathami, said that, she had early on gone to one of the workshops they ran on reporting on science there, and that she's just a really talented journalist. But you were right about it being an airborne virus, and the airborne issue is a perfect example of the way science goes back and forth. And the reason I mentioned the AAAS awards is one of the other award winners there is Roxanne Kamsi from Canada. And she did a really great story on why science got the airborne issue so wrong. And she was actually able to track it back to a flawed paper from decades ago that was misinterpreted and went out as a sort of gold standard of, if particles are a certain size, the virus is not going to be aerosolized. And it turned out when she went back and looked at the original paper, that was not even what it said, right? And so, which is real. So you did have this bad information about it, and then early on, and then people have used that. I mean, one of the things that blows back at Fauci all the time is that early on he said we don't need masks, right? And that's an important point too, and it's something that I think when I was going about I had that quick slide about vetting sources. In science journalism, is that it's important as a science journalist to recognize that science is, like any other human enterprise, enterprise full of all the human errors and flaws and misinterpretation. It's human, right? What is science? Science is people trying to understand the world around us. I mean, that's the core definition of what science was. They use very sophisticated tools to do that often. And I'm not telling you that I could run a cell sequencer, but I do know that that's basically the ethic of science. How do we understand this? And within the community of science, as with the community of journalism, you get all the human flaws, right? Oversimplification, leaps of faith based on not enough research, poorly done studies, right? I mean, any good science journalist needs to look at a study and say, well, what's the size of the study? Is it an N of 2? That's meaningless, right? And so it's important to go and cover science the way we cover every other human enterprise, and to acknowledge that it's going to make mistakes and to cover those honestly. But it's also important for us to do better, and I don't think we necessarily do this well, and acknowledging that science, as I said earlier, is a process. We learn as we go, right? We may think that, it's this and it turns out to be that. We may think, as people also thought with this particular virus, that we would not see a lot of, important mutations because coronaviruses don't mutate the way influenza viruses do. That was also a mistake. And one of the things I think that we should give credit to in the research community is brand new virus. No one had ever dealt with it that came out really emerged 2 years ago. Look at what we know, right? Look at what we understand. Look at the way that we have been able to create very effective vaccines and to come up, and I'm dismissing ivermectin and all the other, ridiculous stuff. But we have been able to come up with some effective treatments as well, right? So even though science stumbles and even though science makes mistakes, it self-corrects. And the body of knowledge that we have gotten from this pandemic is kind of stunning, right? And that's not me going rah science, because you just heard me say that it's a flawed human enterprise, right? But that is me saying that we also really need to make people understand that, and to make them understand that mistakes are part of an honest research project, right? Negative results are part of that too. Those are great questions, by the way. Seriously good.
Oh, who's next?
It's me. Hello,
Yeah,
ma'am.
no. Go ahead.
So I have actually got two questions. One is generally science. Science journalism has a lot of jargons in it. Science generally in a field. So when you write, how do you make sure it is simple and it is accessible to your readers who know the least about your subject? And my second question is, I'm studying financial journalism here in ACJ. So I would could you give some example of some stories where we can add the finance angle or money angle in science journalism, because research and the infrastructure cost huge money in the field.
Yeah, those are both great points. So one of the things about, science in particular, but it's true of any specialty, is there's a whole lot of technical language and jargon in it. And obviously, especially in some areas more than others, incredibly dense, complicated research theories and ideas that go behind it, right? And so I think we all as science journalists wrestle with that and look at, well, how can I best explain this? And so there's a couple of things that I think are tricks of the trade is what I'm going to say. One is that a lot of times that you have, so first, number one thing is that any good science journalist does a whole lot of homework in advance, right? So that you have to get yourself to a point that you can understand what's going on well enough to translate it. As my husband is forever saying to me, what does that mean in English, right? So translate it from the language of science into the common parlance. And so to do that, first, you have to understand it. You cannot do a good translation unless you fully understand what's going on. And when I get into really dense areas of science, and I know that I'm going to be explaining something, that is the one time that I will occasionally go to the scientist I'm working with and say, I'm going to write this, and I want to take you to take a look, not at the whole story, because I don't let anyone see my whole story in advance, except, my editor. But I want you to look at these parts and tell me that I've described this correctly. And especially I'll do that. I haven't done this for a while, but I used to do that a lot when I was covering particle physics and high energy physics or condensed matter physics, right? Where you're just like, okay, right, now I'm going to wade into quantum mechanics and explain why, you can see a reflection in glass, even though glass is transparent. That's quantum mechanics, right? Why can you see a reflection in glass? Glass is transparent. That's a quantum mechanics reaction. How do I explain that? I need someone who actually does quantum mechanics to make sure I'm explaining it in the right way. And I think that's a really handy tool for science journalists when you get really into the dense matter of it. But some things you actually can do enough homework that you understand, right? I mean, I've been a toxicology journalist now for more than a decade, and you know, I can really work my way through it myself. And so I'll do what a lot of science journalists do in that case, is that I'll write by analogy. And you have to, and you see this a lot, especially in astronomy. You know, people will talk about what's a black hole, and they'll compare it to, you know, stars being sucked down a drain or something, so that you're trying to create a visual image in someone else's head. How do I describe that? You know, we tend to think visually, and if you can understand it well enough to make a picture of it in your own head, then you can explain it in that way. And I think it's really important when we're doing these translations to understand that this is not, I'll hear scientists say to me, well, this is dumbing it down. I said, no, it isn't, right? It's just actually taking the information and using it in a language that everyone can understand. Everyone has jargon. Journalism has jargon. If I go to your average scientist and I say, explain to me what an inverted pyramid is, they don't know, right? I mean, that's an easy. So I think you also have to be really comfortable with saying, you know, I'm going to explain this in a clear way. Sometimes when I'm explaining something, I'll bounce it off someone that you know, I know doesn't live in science journalism world, to make sure that I'm saying it clearly. And the other thing I do is I tend to write to I write rather than being a broadcast journalist. I'll write to a specific reader, and I'll create a person in my head. My person is an elderly woman who has not had her first cup of coffee. That's who I always write to. So she's not quite awake. And I will be having her in mind when I'm explaining, right? She's the person I want to get it. I want it to be someone at that level who I know would struggle with anything that's too dense. And that really helps me, because I can say, I should probably give this person a name. I've used her for years, so I'll call her Wanda. I should probably give, you know, would Wanda get this? And you can really work your way through it, right? Once you've figured out those analogies and those translations, you know, you can reuse them. To your other point, science and medicine are a huge business, right? Just look at the pharmaceutical industry, right? And the business of science influences all kinds of decisions in different ways. You know, the cost of a particular medication and who can afford it, right? The handshake between business and regulators. We see this all the time in the United States, right? So the FDA will approve things sometimes based on flawed evidence or iffy evidence. We had a Alzheimer's drug, phenomenally expensive Alzheimer's drug that had limited efficacy. And it became very clear there was a very friendly relationship between the company, I think it was Biogen, I could be wrong though, and the FDA. And so both of them had to pull back in the end. The company had to pull back the price. The FDA had to limit its approval of the drug. Massive criticism. That good journalists get that, right? And they get that there's those issues, and they can explain how business and economic forces drive you know, distribution of medical resources, drive invention, right? You know, people will go through and they'll look at the R&D budgets of different countries, and you can get a real sense of, you know, what that country's priorities are by looking at their R&D budgets. What are they investing in? You know, what are they really supporting? What are they dialing back on? All of that's really important, and all of that is transformative. And you would see that in things like climate change too, the back and forth between what the science is telling us we're in trouble, we should be doing these things, and what economic and business decisions are telling us don't do anything, burn more coal, right? And so a knowledge of that will make you a better business reporter. But when you are getting into science, that combination, I think, is really important. And I see some of the big papers in the United States, for instance, they hire biotech reporters. Stat has Matt Herper, and a large part of their job is looking at that sort of industry science relationship in the way it, brings us different aspects of medicine and science. I think it's, that understanding is really smart, in fact. So.
Thank you.
Who's next?
So me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, I would like to ask that in the current day and age with the COVID still being all over the place, where do you see the intersection between science reporting and health reporting happening? And how can this work in synergy to better inform people? And the second question is that is regarding the budget. I'll just ask that later once.
Okay, so science reporters and health reporters are actually just a distinct species from each other, right? In some ways. So in the United States, there are three big organizations. There's the National Association of Science Writers. There's the American Healthcare Journalists Association, and there's the Society of Environmental Journalists. And people can and do belong to, two or three of those, right? Because obviously we all overlap. But the healthcare reporters, for instance, and you'll notice there's healthcare in the name, they're really looking at public health. The way they look at the pandemic has to be more, is more, how are people treated? The development of vaccines would be in that, whereas science reporters would more traditionally look at things like, what's the origin of the virus? How do viruses evolve, right? What do we know? You would see far more on the science journalism side than the health journalism side. What's the trajectory of the pandemic, right? Or to give you a good example, this is a former fellow of mine, Jane Chu, who is a Chinese journalist based in Beijing. And she just did a long story for MIT's Technology Review on the origins of the COVID virus, right? And it's a very classic science journalism story. It's really good, but in which she really picks apart both, the whole lab leak theory and what we know about this, the different scientists and their attitudes toward it and what seems to be the best. But when you drill down into that story, she's going into these, genetic variations of the virus in incredible detail, right? What does this genetic variation and this particular genome tell us? That's a science journalism kind of story, right? That's not a health journalism story. But, even when I'm talking about that, you can see how much they overlap, so that you actually need, in the pandemic, I can't say that especially, you want communication between, you don't want those walls to be impermeable walls. You don't want the science journalist saying, I'm doing my, viral evolution thing, and I'm looking at the way Omicron had 40 odd mutations, and that was Omicron A2, and now we're looking at BA2, which is the Omicron subvariant, and it has 20 variations on the spike protein. And so a science journalist need to pay attention to that stuff and figure out what's driving that, right? That's a science journalism story. But health journalists need to know that too, because that drives the pandemic. And if you go out and you look at the current numbers, you'll see that BA2 is starting to outpay. It's more infectious than Omicron 1, right? 2 is more infectious than 1. We're starting to see it notch up. What does that mean for the pandemic? What does that mean for medical treatment? What does that mean for immunology? If we, I had, you know, when I got sick with COVID in December, it was Omicron 1, I assume. We don't know because we don't do good testing. And you can see how all of that comes together, right? Part of it means that as both a health reporter and a science reporter, you have to really keep up, right? And you have to both, you know, pay attention to what the preprints are hinting at, and you have to have your cadre. Every good science journalist is a group of scientists that they check in with all the time, right? And I tend to be, just to give you an example, I tend to be more clued into virologists, right? I'm a science journalist. My friend Helen Bronswell at Stat, she has Anthony Fauci's private cell phone number, right? Public health is her thing. And but we talk a lot about this stuff, right? And so, you know, I want to acknowledge that these are different paths, but I want to also say that I can move over into public health if I want to, and she could outdo me in a virology story if she wanted to, right? Because you pay attention to both. I think they're both separate and not separate is my answer. And you had another question?
Ma'am, this was regarding the drugs. Like, for example, when we are talking about ivermectin or drugs like that, my parents work in a pharmaceutical company, so I personally know that especially when the ivermectin thing came out, the companies reaped in huge profits out of that, and the entire awareness about those drugs were pretty low. So people went on a panic mode, they bought more, and they just like even unnecessarily consumed those drugs. So in light of this situation, when there is a lack of, like, people are still, the experts are yet to come out with a response on what the actual situation is. What is the role of a journalist, like, because there is a complete lack of information yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is such a good point. And my friend Federico Cuzzo in Argentina, he said one of the things that he thought had been a problem in Latin America is that some of the journalists had really hyped ivermectin, right? So that people had gone and stockpiled it and looked at it as the answer to all their problems, right? And you certainly saw that in the US as well, that people were prophylactically taking it as if they would never get COVID. And so there's been just a ton of misinformation about it, and it's really been driven, at least in our country, and I suspect in other countries, by mistrust. People don't trust the government. They don't trust the science community. They don't necessarily trust pharmaceutical companies, right? And for good reasons often. This is not a diss on your parents' company, but I moderated a 3-hour webinar on COVID-19 a couple of weeks ago, so I'm super up on some of the international aspects. And the journalist from South Africa was talking about J&J doing a lot of their preliminary clinical trials for their vaccine in South Africa, and then they didn't make the vaccine available in South Africa, right? Because they wanted to charge more than they could do it in South Africa. So they had all these guinea pigs in South Africa and then didn't offer them the vaccine. And so people come in and they say, well, why would we trust a pharmaceutical company, right? So I think there's both the information and there's that kind of layer of mistrust that makes people, go for things that the establishment, as it were, go against the establishment recommendations, right? And are journalists complicit in that mistrust? I think when we overstate something, and I think going back to one of the failings of journalism, because we're an event-driven medium, and when ivermectin first came up, there were people, and there was some science, not that good science, that suggested it was like, a magical cure. And it got reported that way by journalists, right? And so once you've done that, it's really hard to dial it back, right? So I really think, especially with treatments and also with vaccines, you know, what we don't want to do is impart powers to them that they don't have. I mean, it's kind of too late to do that now with ivermectin. But with the new drugs that are coming out, the Merck drugs and the Pfizer drugs, I don't think that we should just be out there saying, oh, magic drug, the pandemic is completely under control. I think we really need to say, here's a new tool. It's very early in the assessment. There's some positive indicators, right? And be really cautious with these kinds of things. And in an ideal world, we would do that. In the world we live in, the cautious story is not the story that gets on the front page of the paper. And so there's also this sort of internal, the mechanics of journalism can lead you to kind of overstate events. And I think we see that with ivermectin. So I'm giving you a fairly complicated answer in which I'm saying there are a whole lot of things I wish we had done differently. I hope we'll do them going forward. I am not 100% sure we will. But I think we should all at least think about it when the next magic cure and silver bullet comes out, right? Because they don't exist, you know, and we need to do our best to kind of add some nuance and context to these things, right? I will tell you, when I was in journalism school and we were talking about the way people react to stories, one of my professors said to me, or not to me, but to the class, and we were talking about the way, he said, you know, the fact of the matter is that some people will read a story about an egg beater and just go insane about egg beaters. So you also have to know that you can't totally control how people are going to react even to the most sane and balanced story, right? You can only do the best you can.
Can you, sir, sorry to interrupt. Can you share the link of the article you were speaking about, if it's available publicly? The one about the origin of the pandemic, which was covered in MIT.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. It's a really beautiful piece of work, right? I was glad I read it and I learned a lot from it.
One last question. Anybody else?
Yes. So hello, ma'am. So, ma'am, my question is kind of an observation, which I feel. COVID has been with us now for 3 years. So there has been a constant flow of COVID news that has been coming up, right? And seeing it from an audience perspective, people have become apathetic to the COVID news. So if we have to sum up this, I feel we call it in mass media or mass communication as a narcotization dysfunction. So how, as a health journalist, should we break that monotony of, you know, that people are interested and still willing to read news about COVID or any such other virus or news?
That's a good question. So back in the day, Andy Revkin, who was an environment reporter, then an environment reporter at the New York Times, coined a term about climate change, in which he said climate change is a slow drip story, right? It's like a piece of evidence, a finding, a indicator, and the slow drip stories, you know, that go on for a long time, in which we're incrementally learning more and continuing to follow the path of knowledge, are the hardest stories to do in some ways, because people get tired of them. And not only do people get tired of them, but their editors get tired of them. But if we look at the example of climate change, which, you know, has been incrementally building for this period of time, it also tells you that you can't quit telling those stories, right? That you have to go out and you have to continue to add to our knowledge of what's going on and build on the foundation of what we've done. I do think that because the pandemic over the last several years has been so intense, and because we've lived through one wave of it after another, right? And because of all the politics and pushback, you know, in the United States, the COVID story of the moment is all these protests by truckers, and they're shutting down commerce, speaking of the business, right? And so it's also a story of human behavior. And I do think at some point when we feel that the pandemic edge itself, especially, we're still in pandemic, but at some point, hopefully this year, we're going to look at it and say, you know, we're wending our way out of the pandemic. We do not have to cover this every day, right? We have to we want to pick the stories. Not that you don't try to do that anyway, but certainly early in the pandemic when everyone's, you know, trying to figure out what's going on and we're just ginning out information to try to help people navigate. I think we're past that now. I mean, I think some of the fundamentals of what's going on are relatively well established. We don't know if there's going to be a fourth or fifth wave. We don't know what the next variant of concern is going to look like. You know, we have those unknowns. But for the most part, I think we have at least reached a point that we have some overall understanding of what's going on. And so now I think the most important thing we do is pick our stories carefully. We don't need to cover every preprint the way we were early on. What we need to do is say, this is information that people actually need to have at this point, right? And just do those stories. And also, as I was saying before about repetition, look for ways to tell those stories in different ways. I mean, I'm sympathetic to this, and I've had moments in this pandemic where I'm just like, I'm just not even going to look at the news for a couple of days, right? And you know, the term doom scrolling was invented in the COVID pandemic, as far as I can tell, and sometimes it will feel that way. But I do think that we're at a point where you're absolutely right, and we should be smart and strategic and say, you know, we don't have to cover every minute of this. Let's look at the ones that are really going to help people as we try to move forward and hopefully move to a different stage of this pandemic and eventually get into some kind of point where the virus is endemic. We all know it's not going away, and we understand, you know, we can give people information about, you know, how often they need to get a booster shot and all the other things that we do with something like influenza, right? And if we're lucky, I mean, COVID is killing hundreds of thousands of people in the US. Influenza usually kills 60 to 70,000 of people a year. I mean, endemic doesn't mean that people don't die. It just means we come to terms with the risk, right? So. These were great questions, you guys. I have talked about COVID a lot, and you've really made me think, and I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for taking time for us, and it's been so quite informative and insightful. And one last thing, would you mind sharing your presentation with us? And quite a lot of them have been asking.
Sure, I'll send you the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'll just share that email. If you can email me, and I'll just share it with them.
Okay.
So once again, thank you so much, and stay safe, and have a good day.
You too. Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.